Welcome back, everybody. I'm Josh McGarry, a pastor at Aletheia Bible Fellowship in Portland, Oregon, and this is HeartScribe Verse by Verse. It's a show where we go through the Bible expositorily and we study its implications for the inner person. So today we are going to start a new thought. Yep, we're going to start a new thought in James after having spent many sessions focused on struggling and trial and suffering. Today, we're going to start by talking about the concept of wisdom. James is going to dip back and forth in this discussion. This is in the book. So this is where he sets essentially the framework for his thoughts on it. And that's extremely important to us because as we study the book of James, we're going to understand, as I've noted in the introduction to James, that James is essentially New Testament wisdom literature. So you're going to get real familiar with this concept. So let's start by opening our Bibles to James with a new verse, 1:5. So James 1:5, let's take a look at it. This going. All right, James 1:5. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Now remember, this comes on the heels of the earlier verses. Consider it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect results, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And then he says, but... So he adds a little something. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So we're going to spend just a couple videos here talking about this verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom. Like I said, it's extremely important. Our last teaching ended by stressing the necessity of endurance in trials and faith, because God is going to use those things to make us complete. And so James, he takes us to the next natural point in the conversation. He says, essentially, okay, I have accepted that I am to live in the midst of these trials, right? I can't really get rid of them, but I also need to live in the midst of these trials in the most meaningful way possible. So the question is, how then do I live in what I know to be true in the midst of these trials and sufferings that now I'm accepting I have to deal with? And this is a big question that Christians oftentimes really spend a lot of time working through. So as we explore this, it's important again to note that verse 4 and 5, they have an interesting relationship to one another. So as we look again at verse 4, wrong screen. As we look again at verse 4, you'll see up here, let endurance have its perfect result, right? Verse 4 notes our impending completion, our impending perfection when we endure trials in faith. And then verse 5 begins with this but statement, or so statement, or therefore, right? The setup of verse 5 essentially leads James's readers to assume that the idea of lacking nothing in faithfully enduring, the idea of being complete, actually opens the door to the implication that nobody is actually complete in their faith, because they still lack something on their own, even though endurance brings them to perfection. And so that's kind of a confusing concept, that these two are like strung next to each other. And so that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today. So yeah, to faithfully endure, and then to need to ask for wisdom is interesting. I kind of think of it as being God has us in his shop and he makes us into this perfectly tuned engine, right? But the engine in the car still needs a driver. So we may be complete and lacking in nothing, but what good is it if the car just sits there because it doesn't have a driver? That's kind of the way that I view it. To faithfully endure and becoming complete means beginning a process of admitting that our wisdom is not auto-generated. It's not something that we create on our own or have on our own, and it doesn't come from within. Instead, even in our completeness, we still have to ask God for this wisdom. Instead, even though the fact that we've gone through this testing, these trials, this endurance, so on and so forth, and it's made us complete in the sense that we can actually now do the things that we were designed to do, we still need the input of God's wisdom. Now that's interesting, especially if you go back to, again, the Genesis account. In chapter 3, you find that man was complete, but he was still meeting with God, talking to him in the garden, and there was an input that was going on, right? So we still need God even in our completeness. And completeness does not mean that we don't need God. It means that we're lacking for, or that we're not lacking for whatever our purpose was that God designed us for. So the nature of our completeness is essentially imminent upon salvation. The moment that we get saved, the moment that we essentially become complete through a process that, in theology we call sanctification. So that is to say that once we are saved, we are as good as complete, essentially, when we lean into our faith in God. And that's because he makes us complete. We're not the ones who do it. We just have to remember that in the face of trials, which is the whole point of the first 4 verses of James. But it doesn't mean that in our completeness we now know everything. The truth is that in our completeness we just know one thing now, which is that we're safe. We're safe with God. But in that safety, there's a whole life that needs to be lived. And that whole life needs to be lived in a sinful world. And so there's a lot to actually navigate there, even though, the tires are right and the engine's tuned and all of these things. And so now that we're no longer afraid of the storm, which is what, James was talking about in the first 4 verses, now that we're not living to remove trials from our life, where do we go from here? And so now that's kind of the setup. It's kind of a long setup, but that's kind of the setup for dealing with James 1:5. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. And he will not rebuke you for asking. There it is, right there. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives all generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. It's notable that James doesn't state that we are to pray for knowledge. Oftentimes, that's what Christians think that we're supposed to do, but we're not. Wisdom and knowledge are 2 different things. They're different from each other. Whereas knowledge is about understanding the truth of something, which now we already understand through salvation, right? That God is in control. Wisdom is understanding what we do with that truth. And so by James telling his readers who feel lacking, even in their imminent completeness, to pray for wisdom, what James is unlocking is something that's really vital to the success of our Christianity in general, to our success as believers. And it is basically our completion through endurance of trials. It isn't just about knowing that this level of personal growth that we can attain is what can happen by biblically engaging with trials. Instead, it opens us up to a choice of what problems and trials we're going to face. It brings us into this maturity process that isn't really about whether we're going to face trials at all, but instead discerning which trials we want to face. Now we need wisdom, not just to the question of should we face trials, but now we need wisdom as to what are the right trials to face? What are the right times? What are the right ways? What are the right purposes? It's like you've entered into a war with an enemy that has a vast army. And the first 4 verses are about, are you going to fight in that war, or are you just going to cower, right? Are you going to whine about the fact that this war is happening? So the first 4 verses are like, don't worry, you can fight this battle. This verse is like, okay, now that you're in the battle, what are you going to do to succeed in the battle? You need wisdom. You need to know the right trials to face, the right times, the right ways, and the right purposes, all regarding the trials that we're going to face. So wisdom, therefore, includes in it a large aspect of choice. Wisdom is about choosing when and where and how to face the trials that come your way. And we perfect this wisdom of discernment, which is closely related, discernment and wisdom. We perfect the wisdom of discernment by pointing ourselves toward issues rather than away from them, right? We angle ourselves by God's grace toward these issues as useful tools. And we ask if it makes sense for us to engage them instead of pretending that they're not there or that we don't have to engage them. So now remember that verse 2 notes that we need to consider joy during the trials that we fall into. But we also, as we talked about last video, we also have to remember that we are to avoid being sadistic and masochistic in our relationship with the trials. So to do that, we need discernment, right? To do that, we need discernment, we need wisdom, and we get this by prayer. And it's done by intentfully inputting God into our trials. Now, that's not to say that he's not there. It's to say that we need to remember that he's there. We need to intentfully input him into our trials by asking what useful tools he aims to equip us with by the various trials that are in front of us. So, yes, we need to walk faithfully into trials, but to walk into these trials without this sense of discernment would have you forgetting that you are a finite creature. And to do that would ultimately make you a bad steward of your life. You would be exhausting yourself and resources that you have in hand at the expense of resources that will only be attained through endurance. You can't just take every single trial that comes your way. You have to pick and choose how you're going to go about these trials. Because we're finite. We're not infinite. We can't hit them all at once. And that's the thing. As a finite creature, some might even say just in the process of adulting in general, we can't take on every problem at once that comes our way. Even if we actually know that God is going to do right by us, no matter what trials we decide to face, that's not the way that we should be facing trials. It's not God's intent for us to exhaust our relational resources that way. That's not how he works. So some of you might be saying, well, is that faithless? Let's check out the book of Acts and talk about that. So, okay, this thing always scrolls the wrong way. Let's go to Acts chapter 6, and let's catch up with the disciples. So, chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Now, at this time, as the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint developed on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So the Hellenistic Jews were basically the new converts to Christianity who were Jews by descent, but they weren't raised Jewish. They were part of descendants who had been sort of captured and spread throughout the land, and so they were raised essentially Greek, and so they didn't live like Jews. Whereas the Hebrews, they stayed very Jewish rooted. So anyway, they felt that their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. Actually, it seems like they were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So the 12, meaning the apostles of Christ, or the disciples of Christ, they summoned the congregation of the disciples and said, "It is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. Instead, brothers and sisters, select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of spirit and of wisdom, whom we may put in charge of this task. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word. The announcement found approval with the whole congregation, and they chose, well, anyway, yes, as we keep going on, they chose all these people, and they brought these men before the apostles, and after praying, they laid their hands on them, and the word of God kept spreading, and the number of the disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests started to become obedient to the faith. So why do I bring this passage up? Acts 6, 1 through 7. Well, the disciples, they had a specific overarching task of spreading the word of God. They didn't ask for the problems that were generated by their success. See, there was a problem that was generated by their success in that task. In at least my ministry, we call those good problems to have, right? But they were still problems. They didn't ask for them, but they did rightfully inherit them. That's part of what the scriptures say when they say that to those who do right, more will be given. They rightfully inherited them. They knew, and this sounds maybe insensitive, but if you go back and you look at about what they said, let's see. It is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables. They knew that running a food program was making it impossible to complete their initial task of spreading the word. And so they appointed others to deal with those problems so that they could return to their original overarching problem. And that wasn't just fine, it was wise. It was wise for them to do. Notice that even Jesus appointed helpers. Like, we know, this may maybe this isn't the greatest example, but it's a true example. Like, we know that Judas Iscariot, for instance, handled the money for the disciples. That was Jesus' choice. So, his basic response is, what do I have to do with money? We know that because he said, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's. But still, money had to be dealt with, and so, they assigned somebody to deal with the money. So even Jesus had disciples and appointed helpers, and and he did it in the Great Commission, obviously. Go out into all the world and make disciples. Like, this is what he tells us to do. Spread that weight, spread that goal. We often think that we're being wise in taking on as much as we can because now we know that we can take on things. And we often think that we're being wise in taking on as much as we can, but that's actually man's wisdom, right? It's always man's wisdom to try to extinguish or consume the resources that we have in order to solve our problems. But God designs us to live in the tension and use discernment because he designs us as finite. We have finite resources. So we have to be smarter than that. And what that does is it also causes us to rely on him. So there's more to say about this, but we're almost at 20 minutes, so we're basically going to end on this note. Your freedom to run with abandon into problems doesn't mean that you should operate without discernment. Your freedom to run with abandon into problems doesn't mean that you should operate without discernment. You have to pray for wisdom. You have to pray for wisdom in your freedom. And just for more info regarding that, I would say check out Acts 6, which is the disciples passage that we looked at, about governing people. And actually, you can look further back. You can look at Moses and his relationship with Jethro, which is his father-in-law. So that's in Exodus chapter 18. So look in Acts 6 and Exodus chapter 18 about like how to govern and to spread that weight and to use discernment and wisdom and how you do that, even when you know that God has your back. And then, of course, remember to, open those Bibles, spend time in prayer, processing our discussion today. Again, reread this passage and try to commit it to memory. And also, if it's been of value to you, please share our content, subscribe to it so that we can get more people that are joining in our discussion with us. Hit the notification bell so you know when our next show comes out. And, study on your own. Thanks for watching and stay vigilant.